report of the critical work by MHC. The university's mission statement says in part that we are a diverse community of learners meeting the needs of the times. And I can think of no other partner that shares that mission any better than MHC. So, excuse me, it's an honor to give you space to hear the report and the words that will be shared today, and to do all that we can to further the mission of this incredibly important organization. So thank you for being here. I will end my welcome and my song and dance so we can get to the meat of the matter today. But on behalf of all of us here at Spalding, including my esteemed colleague, Dr. Stacy Day, it is a delight to have you here. Please make yourselves at home and know that we share your passion, your conviction, and we are here to stand alongside and to join in this good work together. So thank you for being here. Oh, and now I'm supposed to introduce Adam Hall.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Hall, and I'm the Vice President of Community and Economic Development for Kentucky. And I have the privilege of serving as chair of Metropolitan Housing Coalition's board. And so I'm pleased to welcome you who are here in person, and thanks Spalding for hosting us today. And for those of us joining us online, welcome to the release of the 2022 State of Metropolitan Housing Report towards a just housing future in uncertain times. And I think there couldn't be a more appropriate title given the last several years that we've been through. We're gathering today in a hybrid release event due to the ongoing issues of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Once again, we're happy to share this important data with you. While those of you attending in person have access to a printed copy of the report right there by the door, MHC will host a similar report pickup event as we did in 2021, where you can drive by and pick up copies for yourself, for your friends, your students, your neighbors, elected officials, and anyone else that you think needs this information. Please stay tuned for a future announcement on the date and time and location of that event. Before we would get started, I would like to acknowledge my fellow MHC board members. If you raise your hand and wave, thank you for being here. And any elected officials who are with us today, but welcome if you're here and I don't see you. We're pleased you're here to learn more about the critical role that fair, accessible, and attainable housing plays in the well-being of our citizens. The community has spoken clearly in two recent surveys, resoundingly saying that housing and homelessness are the critical issues our city must confront. I also want to give a special thanks to the sponsors who made this year's report possible, including Louisville Metro Government, Develop Louisville, Louisville Urban League, PNC Bank, Rebound, the League of Women Voters, Fifth Third Bank, New Directions Housing Corporation, and the Coalition for the Homeless. I also want to thank the sponsors for today's event, LDG Development, Mendel Scott, and the Weber Group. As many of you know, Metropolitan Housing Coalition facilitates research-based advocacy for fair, accessible, and affordable housing. I'm proud to say that this is the 19th year this report has been produced. Our premier research publication and our annual call to action, it is more than a report, it is a movement. I bet many of you have used this critical data produced in this report to further your work. We ask you to look ahead to 2023 and to how you and your organization can support the 20th anniversary of the State of Metropolitan Housing Report. Over the years, our unique partnership with the University of Louisville has provided incredible research that has been used to further key housing initiatives in this community. This year is no exception, and you will hear more from the research team very shortly. The focus of this year's report is a critical review of Louisville's current housing policies, efforts to improve or implement new solutions, and recommendations for policies which will move Louisville forward toward a more just housing future. This report is a roadmap for elected officials and policymakers, as well as a tool to hold leaders accountable. To get us started, I am pleased to introduce the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, Tony Curtis. As most of you know, Tony has been with MHC now for roughly 4 years, and prior to being named Executive Director, He led development and communications for MHC, where he oversaw fundraising, membership, and external communications. Tony brings over 15 years of nonprofit leadership to his role as executive director. He has a comprehensive knowledge of housing issues and is a single-minded advocate to improve fair, accessible, and attainable housing in Louisville. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you to everybody for being here, both in person and virtually. It's a step in the right direction from last year's all virtual event. So great to see some faces now. The COVID-19 pandemic has dominated and continues to dominate the headlines, forcing us to collectively alter the way in which we live and work. It also continues to magnify the eviction crisis and the larger housing crisis that envelopes our city, our state, and our country. The 2020-21 State of Metropolitan Housing Report took a deep dive into the connection between housing and health. That report helped to develop a more concrete understanding of pandemic-related funding and programs and how those dollars have affected people in our community, and that continue to face this pandemic-induced housing instability due to the threat of eviction, job loss, familial health crises, lack of child care, and the list goes on and on. This is a reminder to us all that we must be vigilant in tracking the short-term and long-term costs of the pandemic on our society, especially in relation to the housing crisis. We are just now seeing the short-term effects, and MHC will continue to track those long-term effects. We start this work today with the 2022 State of Metropolitan Housing Report. Of course, the housing crisis existed long before the pandemic. This is a housing crisis born out of a history of intentional discriminatory policies, barriers to wealth creation, and seemingly insurmountable challenges to attaining a just housing future for all in our community. Every map, every chart, every graph, every table you encounter in this report are a result of past injustices. This history has not disappeared. It continues to influence and shape the data we analyze today to make all kinds of policy decisions. We must not forget this history. But I want to draw attention to two ongoing initiatives in our community that have a potential to change the fair, accessible, and affordable and attainable housing landscape. The first is the Land Development Code reform. If we are able to take the spirit and intent of Louisville's comprehensive plan, Plan 2040, in which fair housing and affordable housing were mentioned for the first time, and expand the Land Development Code to include tools that create housing choice and opportunity, we can decrease residential segregation and increase housing choice in all parts of the city, increase the production of attainable housing, and increase the production of diverse types of housing to meet the needs of our diverse and growing population. MHC launched the Attainable Housing for All initiative to do just this. Fair, accessible, and affordable housing is attainable housing. The second is in relation to the West Louisville TIF. I spoke at the West End Opportunity Partnership Board meeting in April, and I wanted to lift up some of those remarks I made then here again. While the West End Opportunity Partnership focused on 9 neighborhoods, we sometimes forget to magnify that statement even further. The partnership focuses on 9 neighborhoods of neighbors, communities of people. We have to know the people and keep people central to this conversation. Specifically, how people's lives are shaped by housing that is safe, that is stable, attainable, and affordable. There are many needs that must be met and commitments that need to be made up front. If not, it's just another TIF experiment. And here are some of those needs. There is a need to be intentional about protecting people, protecting neighbors who already call these 9 neighborhoods home. There is a need for a commitment to the strongest protection for renters. What anti-displacement strategies do we need to create to protect current residents? Further housing stability is at risk if we do not commit now. There's a need for programs that create pathways to home ownership, that create wealth, and let's talk generational wealth, and create the 22,000 opportunities needed to bring about equity to the disparity between white and Black home ownership. There is a need for programs to control the ongoing and I'm sure oncoming surge in rental prices and rising property values, as rising rental rates and rising property tax bills will cause displacement of many residents. Who owns the land and who owns the rental properties matter. Finally, there is a need for some explicit mechanism, an enforceable mechanism, that will ensure that TIF dollars support housing that is affordable, equitable, and accessible to existing residents. If not, we are going to see signs of neighborhood cracking and diluting of the power of these communities and these neighborhoods. An investment in obtainable housing for all that is affordable, accessible, and equitable is an investment in people, our neighbors, and has a very real impact on access to health, economic opportunity, educational opportunity, access to transportation, access to quality food, on public safety, and the list goes on. A wise woman, Miss Jackie Floyd, once said to me, "Are you of the neighborhood? Or are you in the neighborhood?" Well, being of and being in the neighborhood mean different things, and that matters. So what do you say? Let's make a commitment to the people of these 9 neighborhoods and not to absentee property owners that are in or want to be in the neighborhoods, and will continue to extract this very wealth we are trying to create for these people and living in the neighborhoods. I remind you that none of these initiatives exist outside of each other and all have potential impact on people. I challenge you today to think about this collective impact and the roadmap forward. Housing is the keystone issue in our community. Affordable housing, attainable housing is not a district by district issue. It is a citywide issue of the utmost importance. It is our challenge to find real solutions that are people-centered and build generational wealth. So I extend this invitation to you today, this call to action. Housing advocacy work is always about long-term policy change, long-term systemic change. The 2022 State of Metropolitan Housing Report is a snapshot on this journey to a more just housing future. To ensure this work continues, we need your voice in the community, talking to our leaders in these advocacy efforts. We need you to help drive that change. So what do you say? Will you join MHC in our efforts to make attainable housing reality for all people in all parts of this community? I would like to also take a moment and thank Dr. Kelly Kinahan, who will be leaving us soon for another opportunity in Florida, and acknowledge that you work on this report for a year, in many cases, many years, all coming together, and you become friends, colleagues, partners on a project, experiences the ups and downs of the project. And so we're certainly going to miss you part of this team. You know, we have a friend elsewhere, but we will miss you. And so with that said, you'll hear from Kelly here in just a little bit. I would like to turn this over to Dr. Lauren Heberly, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Management and associate professor of sociology at the University of Louisville. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks to everybody who's here taking time out of your busy day, your lunch hour, to come hear us today. I really appreciate it. This year is, as everybody said over and over again, it's been one of continued upheaval. And I really wanted to acknowledge how important it has been to continue to work with Tony on this year's report and to see that move into the position of executive director with such grace and such talent. Thank you very much for that. I've had the honor of working on this report since 2006, and each year with a different, really wonderful team. Our team this year includes me, Dr. Kelly Kinahan, Associate Professor in Urban and Public Affairs. Rebecca Halpern is a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology. Claire Johnson, who will be joining us via pre-recorded slides, is a recent U of L graduate of our major in urban studies and a future master's student in the urban planning program. We also have Maureen Neal, who is a recent graduate of our master's of public affairs here, also from U of L. This team has been amazing. They've been extraordinarily patient with me as every year. So our focus topic this year does begin with lessons learned from Louisville's deployment of federal, local funds to address housing insecurity during the pandemic. This is arguably the largest investment in housing stability that Louisville has seen in decades. Then we provide a detailed inventory of our housing policies and programs that are cataloged by implementation status. And our team hopes that this is going to serve, as Tony said, as a roadmap, but not as a stagnant roadmap, right? So as you'll see when you look through it, there's a list, there's the inventory of the existing policies.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. They're having trouble hearing. You may have to unmask it.
Oh,
Sorry.
not a problem. Can I test it? Is this better?
Clear.
Yeah,
And those of you who are online, can you let us know in the chat box?
if that works better. Sorry about that.
Yes, much better.
Awesome. All right, I'll start projecting. I'll use my
Teacher
outside- my teacher voice. So we want this to, our vision for this report is that it is a living document that folks can build on, add to. It is not the only policies available to us. We are certainly interested in helping make this an initial working tool for all of us, for advocacy, for our legislators, and for our public officials. And speaking of our local agencies, we remain extremely grateful to all the agencies who continue to provide data and information for this report. That's Louisville Metro Government Offices of Housing, Resiliency and Community Services, the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund, Louisville Metro Housing Authority, the Coalition for the Homeless, JCPS, Kentucky Department of Education, Indiana Department of Education, Louisville Water Company, MSD, and Russell Place of Promise. All of these folks every year and others provide us with the local data that we couldn't do to talk about our housing landscape without. And as you will see, accessible data is especially crucial in improving our ability to better document things such as the scale and unfairness of eviction practices in this city. Thanks also goes to the design team at Grid Principles. So what's in the report? Y'all in the room have a little bit of advantage. So here's our table of contents. There's a lot in the report. We begin with a summary of how Louisville spent the Federal Corona Aid Relief and Economic Securities Act and American Rescue Plan funds through the end of 2021. And we focus in on how those funds were used to address housing insecurity. Our detailed housing policy inventory starts around page 15 in the digital version. It's around 16. Excuse me, that's 15 in the digital and 16 in the hard copy. That's followed by highlights of some important local policy developments in Louisville Metro government that got underway in 2021. And that you'll find on 30 and 31. Our priority recommendations for the next administration and ongoing advocacy begin on page 36 or 37. We also revisit and update some familiar measures and maps starting on page 41 and 42 and wrap up with a few descriptions of efforts that will impact residents living in West Louisville, the West Louisville neighborhoods. Of course, you'll find our detailed data notes and references at the end. We wouldn't be good researchers if we didn't back it up. So today we're not going to cover everything. We've got limited time. What we will cover today includes the following. The emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention efforts. We'll have a brief discussion of the three of Metro government's housing policy and program activities during 2021. That's going to be the efforts to address homelessness, changes to the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and efforts to create the Community Land Trust. We're not going to go through all the measures, although some of our discussion will draw on that information from those sections, and we leave those to you for you to explore on your own. But we are going to talk a little bit more about the TIF. We'll talk a little bit about highlight a few things on the TIF, although Tony already spoke about quite a few of those points. But most importantly, we'll walk you through the inventory and the roadmap for the next administration, highlighting a few of our recommended priorities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen Neal to discuss Louisville's use of our American Rescue Plan funds and the Emergency Rental Assistance Program.
Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. I'm here to discuss the federal funding that was issued. So funding from the federal government, as you'll see in the report, was vital to support the challenges created by the pandemic. And it's been critical for investing in eviction prevention programs, emergency rental assistance, and other programs that support Louisville residents' housing stability. In November 2021, Metro Council approved $89 million in American Rescue Plan funding to be spent on addressing the increasing numbers of residents experiencing homelessness and the ongoing need for more affordable housing. This funding will support key needs in Louisville, which includes investing in units affordable to households earning 30% or less of area median income, funds for permanent supportive housing, and home repair, among other uses. These allocations reflect the community's demands for safe, fair, and affordable housing, along with Metro Council's recognition and allocation of funds in ways that align with the desires expressed by Louisvillians. As the pandemic continued to affect people's ability to work, pay rent, and stay healthy, emergency rental assistance was a key stopgap to keep people safely housed and prevent many, but certainly not all, evictions. Eviction Lab estimates that federal assistance prevented at least 1.36 million evictions nationwide. Since the start of the pandemic, Louisville Metro government has dispersed approximately $68.5 million in past and future rental payments to both landlords and tenants through the end of 2021, stabilizing the housing of 10,086 households and keeping 22,809 individuals housed. Locally, Louisville Metro government dispersed funds from 4 different programs: the Court Eviction Diversion Program, the Community Service Providers Program, Office of Resilience and Community Services Eviction Prevention for Households Program, and the Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Program. There were several ways in which Louisville Metro government and their partners collaborated that helped improve the effectiveness of emergency rental assistance distribution, which nationally many cities struggle to disperse quickly. This is in part because emergency rental assistance was so limited prior to the pandemic, and that's including in Louisville. Louisville Metro government relied on community partners with existing relationships in poor and historically marginalized communities, and this helped ensure rental assistance funds to reach those who needed it most. Examples include partnerships with area community ministries through stopmyeviction.org, and the Coalition for the Homeless extensive outreach and door knocking efforts to contact people facing eviction to ensure their awareness of available rental assistance funds. Community-based organizations that were able to facilitate applications for tenants who were behind on their rent was a vital component of larger eviction prevention efforts and helped to distribute available rental assistance more effectively to tenants in need through community-based outreach and clinics. Louisville Metro government also maintained a presence in eviction court proceedings for the first time. Expanded staffing supported through federal funds allowed for more efficient distribution of rental assistance. This was also critical for tenants in eviction court, where Office of Housing staff could provide updates on cases associated with rental assistance and ensure dismissals when assistance had been paid to landlords. Finally, Louisville Metro government was as flexible as federal rules allowed with rental assistance payments. One example of this is allowing tenants to receive payments directly in cases where landlords refuse to accept rental assistance. Some localities chose not to implement this policy, but this method helped renters to stay housed even when their landlords refused to cooperate, and allowed for funds to be put towards future housing in the event a landlord was unwilling to accept any payment from those that had applied. Another example was adopting fact-based proxy for income verification. And as other states in this country adopted this policy, Louisville Metro government was able to implement the same practices and process applications much more quickly, rather than requiring further income verification documentation. Even with these changes, there were several barriers, and it took a long time to process payments that the city had to learn to overcome. Since the city had not had this large of a budget to dedicate to eviction prevention, innovative infrastructure was not yet established. Applications were initially handwritten and manually entered into databases, which caused clerical errors, making it difficult to contact necessary parties, especially if applications were left incomplete. It was challenging to rectify those errors. Furthermore, applications were only provided in English and required a state-issued ID to prevent instances of fraud, which limited access to different communities. Also, landlords failing to participate in the program was sometimes not communicated. This causes fear and confusion for tenants. They often move out to avoid an eviction on their record, and that results in disruption in housing stability and made it difficult for Metro government employees to issue payments in a timely manner. Finally, both property management companies and Louisville Metro were navigating how to work during the COVID era. Everyone had to battle technological issues working from home, staff being susceptible to falling ill, and filling workplace vacancies during the national labor shortage. While Metro government took several steps to improve efficiency in processing applications, building the structure while battling the sheer volume of applicants in need proved to be certainly challenging. The next few slides describe some of the socioeconomic characteristics of tenants and landlords that receive rental assistance. And this just describes a small portion of the federal funding that was dispersed. In 2021, for the data obtained through the open records request, 1,218 applicants received emergency rental assistance through the Community Service Providers Program, 1,552 through the Court Eviction Diversion Program, and 242 through the Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Program. Most applicants receiving assistance from Court Eviction Diversion and Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Programs were earning 30% area median income or below. This slide shows the Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Program dispersed $544,068 during the 2021 for past due rent only. Figure 4 summarizes the 15 landlords that received funding through the Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Program, with Louisville Metro Housing Authority and its tenants being the largest beneficiary, accounting for more than half of all applications and 40.6% of total funding awarded in 2021. And this next slide describes the tenants across 22 zip codes that were assisted through the Landlord Tenant Rental Assistance Program. The largest share of assistance was received by tenants living in the 40202 zip code, followed by 40219 and 40210. Among these tenants, 66.1% identified as Black or African American, 19% as white, and 4.1% as multiracial, with the remaining choosing not to disclose their race or ethnicity. And I'll now direct you to Claire Johnson's portion. She'll be joining us in a pre-recorded presentation virtual format, and she'll discuss the analysis of eviction trends.
Thank you, Dr. Heberly and Maureen. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there today, and I do appreciate the opportunity to be able to present virtually. As Maureen discussed in the previous slides, eviction prevention programs were substantially expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 2021 data from the courts that process eviction filings reveal that government intervention through a combination of federal, state, and local policies, combined with efforts from community advocates, has led to a sustained reduction in eviction filings in Louisville and nationwide. These policies resulted in a 38.8% decrease of eviction filings in 2021 compared to the pre-pandemic levels of 2019. Even as COVID-related income assistance programs and policies like federal and state unemployment insurance ended in 2021, eviction filing rates had not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels locally or nationally. This is directly attributable to eviction moratoriums and widespread emergency rental assistance. Figure 10 displayed here and on page 61 of the report shows the percent change of eviction filings disposed by quarter and year in 2019, 2020, and 2021. There were reported 7,911 total filings with dispositions for the first 3 quarters of 2021. compared to 13,000 for the same 3 quarters in 2019. Although 2021 eviction filings in Louisville remain below pre-pandemic levels, it is important to note that total filings with dispositions reflected a 52.6% increase compared to the first 3 quarters of 2020. The eviction filing rate for the first 3 quarters of 2021 was reported as 6.6%, which is lower than the filing rate of 10.8% for the same time period in 2019. However, this is an increase from the eviction filing rate of 4.3% for the first 3 quarters of 2020. Significant increases of 3,795.3% in the second quarter of 2021 and 64.4% in the third quarter from 2020 demonstrate the power of the combined state and federal eviction moratoria enacted at the start of the pandemic in March of 2020 that drastically lowered eviction filings and ultimately kept people housed. In Figure 11, shown here and on page 61 of the report, monthly eviction filing counts are tracked by month for years 2019 in light orange, 2020 in purple, and 2021 in dark orange. Eviction filings were down by 19.5% in the first quarter of 2021 compared to the first quarter of 2020. Overall, the monthly eviction filings in 2021 were roughly 60% of the 2019 pre-pandemic level eviction filings. We can see here that filing rates increased in quarter 1 of 2021, resulting in the total number of filings in March nearly matching the total number of filings in March of 2019, with a difference of only 6 filings. Eviction filings began to drop around mid-March to early April of 2021, roughly coinciding with the start dates of local emergency rental assistance programs, the adoption of the right to counsel ordinance, and changes to eviction court processes for those that applied for rental assistance. Filing rates began to climb again in September of 2021, likely due to the end of the CDC eviction moratorium on August 26. As shown here in Figure 14 and on page 64 of the report, eviction judgments decreased substantially in the first quarter of 2021, down 49.8% from 2020 and 62.4% from 2019. The decrease is likely due to the CDC eviction moratorium and local emergency rental assistance programs. In quarter 2, judgments rose dramatically compared to 2020 by roughly 1,375%, but remained about 75% lower than in 2019. As with eviction filings, this sizable increase from 2020 reflects the low number of judgments in the second quarter of 2020 when the Federal CARES Act eviction moratorium was enacted and the Kentucky Supreme Court suspended eviction hearings until May 1st of 2020. Overall, eviction judgments through the first 3 quarters of 2021 were 70.3% lower than judgments through the first 3 quarters of 2019. The difference is likely attributable to the funding available through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and local policies supporting tenants in eviction court. Through the first 3 quarters of 2021, about 1/4 of all eviction filings resulted in a judgment against the tenant. This is far lower than 2019, when roughly half or more of all filings resulted in a judgment against the tenant. Again, these differences are likely connected to additional legal support for tenants through the right to counsel ordinance, as well as emergency rental assistance programs supporting tenants facing eviction for non-payment of rent. Although the 2021 judgment rates weren't lower compared to both 2019 and 2020, we can see here that warrant rates in the first 3 quarters of 2021, shown in light purple, were higher or roughly similar to warrant rates in 2019 and 2020. The consistently high warrant rates are a reminder that despite improved eviction prevention policies, many tenants are still being removed from their homes in an ongoing pandemic. This indicates that there are important gaps in existing policies like emergency rental assistance, which is only able to support tenants facing eviction for non-payment of rent. Renters facing eviction for other reasons like lease expiration or lease violations have less support. While the expanded legal assistance made available through the right to counsel ordinance is an important start, the power dynamic within eviction court remains overwhelmingly in favor of the landlord. Map 8, shown here, displays the 2021 eviction filing rates for quarters 1 through 3 by census tract in Louisville, Jefferson County. The eviction filing rate for Louisville for 2021 was 6.6%, with census tract eviction filing rates ranging from 0 to as high as 21.7%. There were 7 census tracts with 0 eviction filings, all of which are located in areas of concentrated white affluence with very few rental units in the northeastern and far eastern regions of Jefferson County. The census tract with the highest rates of eviction filings in 2021 are primarily located in the southwest and south central areas of Jefferson County. Of these census tracts with the highest eviction filing rates, the majority of residents in all but one tract are white, non-Hispanic, Latino. The broader spatial patterns observed in the map show the highest eviction filing rates concentrated in western, southwestern, and south central Louisville, which roughly aligns with the spatial concentration of areas with higher shares of Black and Hispanic Latino households and households experiencing poverty. In comparison to the spatial patterns of eviction filings in 2019 and 2020, there does appear to be a relationship between the census tracts with lowered rates of eviction filings in 2021 to areas that received a higher percentage of applications for the rental assistance program. Moving forward, in order to avoid a trend that returns to pre-pandemic eviction levels, continued rental assistance, rent regulation, just cause eviction policies, and protection from the conversion of subsidized affordable rental units to market rate units are needed to continue to keep eviction filings low and to increase housing stability. Thank you for your time. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the team.
All right. Thank you, Claire and Maureen. During 2021, there were many notable updates to housing policies and programs that impact access to safe, fair, and affordable housing in Louisville. Starting on page 31 of the report, you will find our discussion of key Louisville Metro government policy developments. The report covers updates to the Fair Housing Ordinance, the ongoing land development code review, efforts to establish community land trusts, new guidelines for the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund, updates to the vacant property and land bank programs, including the importance of the conservative law that went into effect January 2022, and significant efforts to address homelessness. We also briefly touch on regulations impacting rental registries and short-term rentals. So today, we first highlight efforts to address homelessness, then changes to the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and community land trusts. Several of the others will be discussed in the context of the policy roadmap later in the presentation. To address homelessness, Metro Council approved $1 million in the annual budget from general funds, which supported approximately 3,020 people through a variety of programs and services. More importantly, of the 89 million American Rescue Plan dollars that were allotted to address homelessness and housing affordability, 32 million were allocated for about 200 permanent supportive housing units, and 1.5 million allocated for a safe outdoor space for people in need of shelter, and 7.5 million to renovate and convert a building adjacent to that safe outdoor space into housing units that serve as a bridge to permanent housing for unsheltered individuals. The safe outdoor space is intended to help address the needs of Louisville's residents that are not using the emergency shelter system, and to do so in such a way that meets folks where they are, rather than expecting them to seek out services in shelters. Two important policy updates also occurred. The first is the Homeless Protection Ordinance, which requires the Office of Resilience and Community Services to perform a risk assessment demonstrating a clear risk to health and or safety before Louisville Metro can issue a 21-day notice to clear encampments. Second is Louisville's Fair Housing Ordinance Amendment, which went into effect back in March 2021 and establishes homelessness as a protected class. This may help mitigate one problematic housing issue low-income tenants who rely on rental assistance from Section 8 seem to often face, which is discrimination. For example, a very recent report from the Louisville Metro Human Relations Commission in late May found that a Louisville apartment complex discriminated against tenants based on both their race and their source of income. It's important to note that this ordinance does not require landlords to participate in the housing choice voucher program. And going forward, it will be essential to watch how this amendment is enforced. Turning to the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund, there was an important change made in the last budget allocation. The ordinance that established the trust required that they dedicate and therefore track and report half of their budget to households at or below 50% area median income. Fiscal year 22's budget stipulates that the trust dedicate $2.5 million for those households earning 30% or less AMI, which is $23,050 for a family of four. Additionally, the entire $40 million the trust received from the ARP funds must be spent on creating between 200 and 250 units for residents at or below 30% AMI. These requirements are intended to address the need for the approximately 31,000 units that are affordable for households at or below that 30% AMI income level, which is identified in the 2019 LMG Housing Needs Assessment. So now I will turn it back over to Dr. Lauren Heberly to discuss other policy and program updates.
Thanks, Becca. Just one note of clarification. I think the 40 million of ARP funds is for up to 250 units to be dedicated for folks 30%. So there's a little bit of a nuance in that language there, but that the intent of focusing on 30% AMI has clearly been articulated in that. In that funding. Thank you. Maryland takes good care of it. So I just wanted to, one of the other things we talked about briefly, and I think it's getting a lot of traction these days in Louisville, is the community efforts towards developing a community land trust. And so the city announced that in December of 2020, that's going to use $2.1 million of federal community development block grant funds to partner with Rebound and to establish the community land trust that will serve Louisville's Smoketown and Russell neighborhoods. And this is not a new tool, but it's new to Louisville. We have different kinds of land trusts here in Louisville. Most of our environmental conservation land trusts. This will be our first that's dedicated for housing. And so I thought I'd briefly reiterate what they are, because they're new to a lot of folks. And community land trusts basically create a form of cooperative property ownership where the land and building ownership is separated. Typically, the land is owned by a mission-driven entity, usually a nonprofit. That's the trust. And buildings on those parcels are owned or leased by those who live there. So community land trusts include legal provisions in the creation of the trust that govern ownership and transfer and sale of the building to maintain permanently affordable housing. So that's the goal, right? It's to make ownership more accessible and stabilize ownership by removing those properties from real estate speculation markets by using a more cooperative ownership model. So this is done through formulas the trusts use to calculate permissible resale values of those buildings. So these have been under discussion in Louisville for several years now, as folks in government and in the nonprofit spheres learn more about how cooperative ownership models could be used to maintain affordable housing. So in addition, as part of Louisville Metro government's anti-displacement strategies, the land bank is going to transfer parcels to the community land trust once the structure of the land trust is determined by participating residents. So other partners in this include the Center for Neighborhoods, Bates Community Development Corporation, and River City Housing Corporation. The Rebound and CFN are working together to engage neighborhood residents in establishing the new 501c3 and to help folks learn more about the cooperative ownership models. There are other organizations looking into creating additional community land trusts, and they won't all necessarily work the same. Some may use different formulas to govern the resale value, for instance. Therefore, there's going to be a need for those who launch them to be very transparent and to ensure that the impacted residents and neighborhoods understand the benefits, especially who benefits. So there's been some voiced concern over the possible outcome of limiting wealth building opportunities for Black residents who have historically been limited from profiting from investments in the real estate market. And some have questioned if residents are adequately and authentically included in the creation of the trusts that impact their neighborhoods. So this is something that's going to need a constant vigilance, right? And constant transparency to really have a understanding of what cooperative ownership looks like, right? So I wanted to make sure we highlighted that piece. The latest data on the measures that we've covered in previous years start around page 41 or 42. And those following those are a few highlights of initiatives in West Louisville neighborhoods. And then we'll come back to the housing inventory, but I did want to talk just a minute about the TIF. Tony already spoke quite a bit about it, so I wanted to explain it one more time for folks in the back, right? So again, the West and Tax Increment Finance District is made up of 9 neighborhoods in West Louisville. And the intent of the TIF enabling legislation is to increase economic development and investment in the area, right? We highlighted today because there's still, as Tony said, there still remains a great deal of work to ensure it doesn't end up displacing current residents in the area, and that benefits actually accrue to existing residents. The bill also established and authorized the West End Opportunity Partnership to oversee these programs and the implementation of the state and local TIF incentives. This means that WEOP will receive and manage 80% of the new tax revenue collected over the 20-year life of the TIF district. They will also oversee $20 million from donations and Louisville Metro funds and $10 million from the state. So in the report, we lay out the details of the authorizing legislation related to the purpose of the TIF. That includes like the tax credit for homeowners, the inclusion of neighborhood representatives on the WEOP board, an advisory subcommittee, and some of the WEOP's obligations. We've also identified several important problems in the legislation. There's no clear process for tracking and reimbursing the homeowner tax credit in the legislation. Now, mind you, this is the problems with the legislation, right, as it stands. There is no binding language to ensure that all housing developments include affordable housing. It just says it should. It does not say how. No requirements for residential engagement or input beyond having one representative from each of the 9 neighborhoods on the board. The advisory subcommittee of the board is just that, advisory, with no voting power. Lastly, there's nothing in the legislation that will protect renters in the neighborhoods. Others have noted these criticisms in a variety of venues and platforms, and many rightfully question whether TIFs under any circumstance can actually benefit those who live in the areas that they impact. Even if WEOP creates processes to address these problems, and they are attempting to do so, there's nothing in the law that would require that they be maintained. Right, so one important intervention could come from Louisville Metro government, who could establish local participation and binding affordable housing requirements in the local participation agreement that is required by under the TIF law. Since the state TIF legislation does not include specific requirements for the creation and maintenance of existing affordable housing, local policies will need to be established separately and be firmly in place to mitigate involuntary displacement caused by TIF projects. Displacement should not be an expected or acceptable outcome of these investments. So with that, it's a good thing that we've created an affordable housing inventory and roadmap to help the next administration avoid that outcome. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kelly Kinnahan to talk about that.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks everybody again for being here today. So in the report, we use the local housing solutions policy framework to both analyze some of Louisville's existing housing policies and to inform the recommendations that come out of the report in terms of where our future housing policy and investments should be focused.
So the local housing solutions policy framework is a comprehensive tool that helps provide us a baseline of understanding for, again, some of the existing policies that are in place, for those that are proposed or in progress, and then the gaps in our current housing policy landscape here in Louisville. So this roadmap is intended to support and inform housing advocates, policymakers, and tenants as they work together to create a more just housing future in Louisville. So the local housing solutions policy framework includes 4 primary categories that are shown up here on the screen. The first is to create and preserve dedicated affordable housing units. Second is to increase the overall housing supply. Third is to help households access and afford private market homes. And lastly, to protect against displacement and poor housing conditions. So again, we chose this framework because we think it's comprehensive. It was very recently developed. It's practical, and it's oriented towards reducing both racial and economic disparities that we know exist across our city. So there are also some limitations to this framework. It approaches housing policy from our current socio-political context here in Louisville and the United States, where we know that housing is viewed as a commodity, and there are lots of profit-seeking actors that are involved and play a critical role in housing production and in affordable housing production. So many of the policies that are tracked through this framework rely heavily on collaboration with these profit-seeking entities, which could be a limitation of the framework and sort of our broader U.S. housing policy structure. So in our analysis, both what I'm going to highlight today and in sort of the policy gaps that we highlight and our recommendations in the report, we pay particular attention to those policies that would support a fundamental right to housing, as these policies are critical for a just housing future in Louisville. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to highlight some of these key recommendations. And again, we encourage you to spend some more time with the roadmap and the inventory in the report, which starts on page 16, to understand sort of the full scope of housing policy in Louisville, where those areas for improvement and where those areas for improvement exist. So the first pillar, again, creating and preserving dedicated affordable housing units. So a key recommendation that we want to highlight in an area that we think is an existing policy gap in Louisville is around expanding rights of first refusal. So rights of first refusal give priority consideration to, for example, tenants that might be seeking to purchase a multifamily building and convert it to cooperative housing. This can also help prevent the conversion of subsidized rental properties to unsubsidized properties by, again, providing time for tenants or other types of mission-oriented organizations and buyers to obtain those properties. So this policy is particularly important for preserving our existing affordable housing stock, as well as preventing, again, the conversion of currently affordable units to unaffordable or market rate units. So our sort of recommendation here is around Louisville Metro government developing consistent policies across all of the affordable housing programs to ensure that rights of first refusal exist and that they prioritize groups like tenants associations that might be interested in purchasing buildings. And so an example or a policy model here would be the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which exists in Washington, D.C. So the second pillar focuses on increasing the overall housing supply. So this is focused around allowing all types of new construction that support a variety of housing types, right? So including things like duplexes, triplexes, smaller apartment buildings, and other kinds of multifamily housing. We know that this is a necessary long-term change for Louisville, and we know that this requires altering some of our existing rules and codes that regulate land use and development. A lot of this conversation is already underway, right? So other folks have alluded to the Land Development Code Reform Initiative, and this is a critical piece of this conversation. So many of the recommendations that are included and proposed in phase 2 and 3 of the LDC reform would allow for these more dense housing types to be built across Louisville and Jefferson County. And this would align with transit-oriented development approaches and other things that are outlined in the comprehensive plan Plan 2040. We also advocate taking these recommendations a step further. So this would include eliminating zoning designations that are only permitting the development of single-family homes. So early evidence from some other cities that have adopted this bold step, including Minneapolis, have shown that this change in policy can affect rents. So we've seen some slight decreases in rents, particularly in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. And this is during a time when we know nationally that rents are rising exorbitantly. So turning to the third category of policies, helping households to access and afford private market homes. So one of the critical gaps that we identified in Louisville's housing policy framework is funding for rental assistance and security deposits. So we have learned through the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was created because of the pandemic that we've had some temporary solutions in this area, but we know that long-term solutions are necessary. So as Maureen and Claire noted earlier, some of the lessons that we've learned from deploying these federal funds over the last 2 years include an understanding that this policy change directly affects our ability to keep people housed, that it helps to lower our overall eviction rates, and that it's most effective when it's not overly burdensome on tenants and those that are seeking assistance. Additionally, we now have the infrastructure in place locally to administer this type of program. So both within Louisville Metro government and within community partners, again, because we've had these federal funds flowing into the city for emergency rental assistance. And so our recommendation here is that we capitalize on that now. So capitalize on that institutional infrastructure and that institutional knowledge that currently exists. So again, an example of this type of policy would be the local rent supplement program in Washington, D.C. So this is a locally funded rental subsidy that covers the difference between market rate rent and what a household can afford. So these types of policies that directly support tenants are really necessary alongside our other long-term investments in terms of building and maintaining our current affordable housing infrastructure. Lastly, protecting against displacement and poor housing conditions. Again, the housing policies that have been enacted because of COVID-19 have offered important lessons around eviction prevention. So again, we've heard a little bit more about this from Claire earlier. But we know that a combination of robust rental assistance and limitations on landlords' ability to file evictions can substantially reduce our overall eviction activity. So one example of a policy around this is a just cause eviction ordinance. So this would be one way to limit landlords' ability to file evictions, specifically those that are tied to lease expirations without any other reason associated with them. So examples of these types of ordinances exist in other Midwestern cities like Chicago and New Orleans, among other places. There were proposals in this year's General Assembly to allow adoption of parts of the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act, rather than requiring localities and municipalities to adopt URLTA in its entirety. So MHC, Louisville Metro government, and other advocates should continue to push for these kinds of changes, which would pave the way for the adoption of local amendments like a just cause or a good cause eviction here in Louisville. So with that, I will turn it back to Lauren for some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Kelly. So I want to encourage you all to really take time with the inventory that we've got in the book. It's a lot, right? There's like 90 policies we talk about in there, and so it does take some time to go through it, and hopefully it will serve as again, as I said at the beginning, as a way that we can help folks hold Louisville Metro accountable and all players accountable as we move forward in implementing some of these things. So we've learned so much in our efforts to help folks maintain stable housing during the pandemic. I keep hearing the big lesson is we can do a great deal with federal funds, but we still need to maintain the infrastructure created to get those dollars out to those who need them most, right? We must not lose the capacity we gained in human, physical, and structural resources that are required to improve and protect access to safe, fair, and affordable housing. We also learned that we can halt evictions, and the world didn't end. And in fact, for many, it was made better. We think the data show that the moratorium saved lives. Public dollars were spent keeping the public safe. We also learned that changes to the eviction court system and legislation protecting tenants' rights is a must. Right to counsel is a minimum baseline and should be publicly and adequately funded. And we need more housing. Specifically, we need more affordable housing, and we need more publicly funded housing. We knew this before the pandemic, and more of us should have been paying attention. Finally, we need to address the ongoing and ever-present racialized housing policies that continue to extract wealth from Black households in Louisville. Changes in housing and land use policies must contribute to remedying those legacy and ongoing practices. The private real estate market will not fix this without intentional and enforceable policy change. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for a few questions. But before we part, and I hope some of you are going to be attending LMHA's celebration for Mr. Manfred Reed this afternoon. I heard that was coming up. But I wanted to publicly thank Dr. Kelly Kinahan for being my co-author on the reports for the past several years. She's brought incredible substance to our work, and I've learned so much from her. She is off to Florida State University in the fall, and we're all going to miss her so much. Miss her deep housing policy and expertise and advocacy. So please join me in thanking her and wishing her well in that soon-to-be underwater state. They're so lucky to get you. Okay. So questions, I'm gonna, Tony and I think Stacy are gonna facilitate questions from online.
And we have a comment from Claire Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Kinahan. You truly do this.
Thanks, Claire.
And we got some clapping hands from Charlie.
If there's any questions, I didn't see any in the chat.
I will take the opportunity as the Director of Development Louisville to thank Kelly also. You will be missed. I've had the opportunity to work with you for the last 5 years, 4 years on the state of housing, and it has been my pleasure, and you will be missed. Lauren, you got to find some.
I know.
Fill those big shoes.
I know. You're huge.
I think it's a great job. I think it's a great report. I really am excited about it. So thank you.
That means a lot, Marilyn.
Develop Louisville will use it as a roadmap moving forward. We'll combine with our housing needs assessment, and we will make a great big map.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Hollaback. I'm with the Center for Health Equity at the Department of Public Health and Wellness. I guess I had 2 questions. One is, I know there was also a lot of federal funds for utility and water assistance, and I'm just curious about like the conversation around policies and emergency supports for that, because I think it's part of like the overall housing cost. And then I guess the other question is, do you guys have anything planned for, carrying forward future discussions of the policies and maybe like a more public forum? Or so yeah, those are my 2 questions. And thank you for a great report.
Thanks, Rebecca. I can speak to the utilities. So we do.
Can you start by repeating the question?
So Rebecca Hollaback asked about the information or connection to utility assistance. So with water bills and for utility electric bills, right? And we did lay out last year. We had an easier time laying out how those programs were being deployed by each of those entities, by LG&E and MSD, the water company. This year, we were able to get data from the water company regarding that. We were not able to get shut off data from LG&E. That's the only way we were able to get that last time was through the rate case that was filed. That's when we sometimes get more detailed information. That said, those programs are crucial in keeping people housed, and some of that money flowed from through Louisville Metro government directly to LG&E to make payments for folks under the application process for that assistance. Some of it flowed through for the water company, for the water utilities. They had a separate program that was set up directly to them. In both cases, those payments went directly to the landlords in how those checks were cut for utilities. In most cases, I think there were a few that where folks were able to use their money, use assistance that they got, and they could use it for utilities that wouldn't necessarily have to do that. So in moving forward, I think that the shut off moratoriums for utilities were absolutely crucial in folks who could afford rent, but the utility costs were out of hand, right? And sometimes you have to make those choices. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that those have to be on the table. So we do mention those in there as part of an integrated housing policy. Cost of shelter, right?
And to Rebecca's second question, I would just say, yeah, that I think we view this inventory as the start of a conversation, right? So we know that there's about to be a big change in local government, right? We're gonna have a new mayor. I think we have a lot of important partners in the room that should be part of the continued conversation about what is the future of housing policy in Louisville. And so I think, we hope that this inventory would be a baseline for starting that discussion. So with actors in the room like Center for Health Equity or Center for Neighborhoods and LISC, as well as the newly formed tenants organization, tenants association. So again, our kind of intent with this inventory was that this could sort of be the start, the baseline of that conversation moving forward. And if somebody wants to add anything to that.
Good question from.
Okay.
Yeah, can I conclude here real quick?
For sure.
And MHC is working with through a grant with the U.S. Water Alliance right now, in conjunction with Louisville Water Company and MSD. And so a lot of that conversation is about affordability, accessibility, and equity. And they are looking, 1, 5, 10, 20 years out right now. We hope that's something we can eventually get to with a conversation with LG&E down the road. Not hopeful at this point, but it all needs to be a part of this conversation.
Okay, we have a couple things from the audience. Our immediate past executive director, Kathy Kuhn, is joining us from remotely today, says excellent presentation and report. And Celine, I'm going to watch this, Mudia. Say a bunch. Thank you, Mudia Maria. Sorry, Celine. Says, thank you for the presentation. It was great. I have a question. I was at a Metro Council meeting last week and members of the #StopTheTIF campaign spoke about using the TIF funding to instead fund a people's housing trust led by community members to build housing affordable for those at 30% AMI or lower. Are there other states doing this? Is this something MHC might support to ensure that the people of the West End have control over development and investment in the area? She adds, as a housing justice advocate, it makes sense to me for Metro Council to redirect their $10 million investment to a People's Housing Trust Fund controlled by West End residents.
I think that's a great question, right? And I think it's an important challenge to how the TIF was actually passed, right? So I can speak as myself as a researcher and as somebody who's been looking at some of this. I'm going to leave it to Tony to talk about where MHC might stand on that kind of inquiry. I do think that there is a lot to be said about being critical of using a TIF as a tool for investment, because it takes public tax dollars and puts them in the hands of, in this case, it's in the hands of WEOP, which we like that we know we know the folks on the board, right? We work with them. All of us have various relationships with them. They all have good intentions about what they want to do with this money to reinvest in West Louisville. That said, it's taking it out of public scrutiny, right? When TIFs, that's what TIFs do, right? That those dollars, unless it's written into the practice of the agent entity that creates the TIF, it takes it out of public scrutiny, right? So that's my philosophical objection to TIFs in general. And so, I would encourage folks to keep asking those questions, and I'll let Tony address what MHC stand on that is.
Yeah, I just saw this morning, actually. So I think when we've had conversations, there's been a lot of conversations about potentially using TIF funds to invest in kind of rental subsidy programs, potentially in that area. There have been conversations about pathways to home ownership as being interested opportunities as well. As far as the TIF itself, or as far as the Housing Trust Fund itself, it serves Louisville, right? It does not serve just specifically West in Louisville. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how this is structured or what the thought process is behind it, because it might not be an either or, it might be an and question or a solution to this. So I'd be interested to hear more details. I don't know all the details behind it.
Any other questions? And we would be, so about convening further conversations, we'd be happy to participate, and other folks as y'all want us. I'm sure Tony will be around for that bit. We don't have plans to do the convening ourselves. We offer it up as a tool for others to convene and lead those conversations as you see fit.
Thank you, everybody.